Hello, welcome to the Quilts of Upper Canada. To begin with, let us make one thing clear. Blankets are not quilts, and quilts are not blankets. A blanket is an oblong single layer of cloth, usually though not necessarily thicker than a sheet, that is used to provide warmth on a bed or over a body. A quilt is also an oblong warm bed covering, but consists of a layer of soft padding between layers of cloth, which are tacked together in some manner to hold them all in place. Though quilts have been around since medieval times, patchwork quilts did not come into their own until quilt making came to North America. The old world favored whole cloth quilts. If the outer two layers of a quilt are made from single pieces of cloth, then it is a whole cloth quilt. What we have here in the museum are patchwork quilts. Patchwork comes in two types, pieced and applique. Throughout the late 1700s and the 1800s, much of the bedding in Upper Canada was made from materials spun and woven at home. Cloth could be bought, but money was scarce, and purchased material was a luxury. At first, as early as 1790s, linen was generally used. Though cotton cloth and thread was easier to use and cotton was more suited for our climate, cotton could not be grown in Upper Canada. Linen is made from flax, which could be grown here. Upper Canada residents continued to grow and spin flax into the third quarter of the 1800s, though cotton cloth and thread was being sold by the end of the first quarter of the 1800s. Wool production in Upper Canada started later than flax. It takes longer to establish a flock than it does to raise a crop. By 1840, there were several woolen mills in the area, but spinning and weaving remained mainly home industries. Though all wool cloth was made, much of the cloth was woven with cotton or linen yarn as a warp and wool as a weft. Much of the spinning and weaving was done by the unmarried women in the families. They were the only ones who had the time. Weaving was also done by local professional weavers from yarns spun by the housewives. The amount of cloth produced was not great, but was sufficient to supply cloth for the quilts and blankets needed. The frugal women of Upper Canada used scraps left over from making clothes in the construction of piece quilts. As well, the earliest quilts in Upper Canada were made of usable pieces from worn-out clothes and bedding. We have many different types of quilts in the Lynde House Museum, but the two most represented are simple tied squares quilts and log cabin quilts. A couple of the tied squared quilts are made with homespun material, woven wool and linen or cotton. They date between the late 1700s and the mid-1800s, though homespun was still being used up until the early 1900s. Around the middle of the 1800s, homespun cloth started to fall out of style. It was considered country and old-fashioned. You can see here the cotton or linen warp threads and the wool weft threads used to make the homespun. This quilt is made with some purchased cloth, most certainly scraps left over from making clothes. It was tied at the corners of the squares instead of being quilted. Quilting with wool thread is extremely difficult, but tying with wool meant that cotton thread did not have to be purchased. Wool thread could be made at home. This houndstooth check patch would have been from a professional weaver or the woolen mills that were in the area by 1840. For the backing, pieces of cloth such as worn-out blankets were often used. Whatever the material, they were usually pieced together to make a large enough back. For these old quilts, the padding or batting between the layers was usually wool fleece, though in the earliest years anything might end up there, an old blanket, another worn-out quilt, and even old clothes. This utilitarian type of quilt was not made as a best quilt. It was used to keep warm in the long, cold Canadian winters, and was kept going as long as it held together. The frugal housewife would patch the squares when they became worn or damaged, as shown here. When making the quilt, the squares themselves were sometimes pieced, as you can see. Material was expensive to buy and time-consuming to make. Every scrap was used. Nowadays, we call a quilt made from many different patterns and colors of material a scrappy quilt. These tied squares quilts were the original scrappy quilts. The log cabin block appeared in the mid-1800s and has remained popular up until the present. It consists of narrow strips of material arranged in concentric squares around a central patch. The block would be pieced on a square of fabric for a foundation. Remember, all of this piecing was being done by hand. Each of these strips were carefully and laboriously hand-stitched on the foundation fabric. With careful placement of light and dark fabrics, many different patterns could be made with the log cabin block. This block was also a scrappy block, so it could use any type and color of fabric that they had. This pineapple pattern is a variation of the log cabin block and also appeared mid-1800s. The pineapple is a symbol of opulence and hospitality, so this pattern was very popular for best quilts kept for company. Since it was made of small pieces of fabric, it was also popular for its use of scraps. It is still a popular pattern for today's quilt makers. Crazy quilts are so named because their pieces are not regular, and they are scattered across the top of the quilt like crazed, cracked or crackled, pottery glazing. They were very popular between the 1870s and the 1910s. We have several in the collection. There are various theories of the origin of this pattern. The one I like best is that it was inspired by the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, a big event in a Victorian society. One of the most popular exhibits was the Japanese pavilion with its fascinating crazed ceramics and asymmetrical art. Crazy quilts were originally made of silks, satins, velvets, and other expensive fabrics. Even lace was included. Each seam was embroidered with fancy stitching. Motifs were embroidered on the fabric sections. Flowers were very popular. Sometimes paint was used to create a design. Another popular motif on crazy quilts was a horseshoe for good luck. A name has been added to this quilt, Mrs. Cormley. Was she the maker of the quilt or the recipient? A quilt like this was a work of art that could take months to create. Because of the materials used, these early quilts have deteriorated badly in places. You can see how the fabric here has shredded. These earliest quilts were not washable, so they were seldom used as bedding, but rather were displayed on a made bed and removed for sleeping. After the early 1900s, women started using more affordable and durable fabric for crazy quilts. Redwork is a form of North American embroidery that developed in the 1800s and was particularly popular between 1855 and 1925. It traditionally uses red thread because red dyes were the first commercially available color-fast dyes in the form of turkey red embroidery floss. Redwork designs are composed of simple stitches and were mainly used to decorate household objects, especially quilts. Patterns for individual quilt blocks were sold for a penny, making them popular and affordable. The main stitch used in redwork is a backstitch or outline stitch. Redwork was a common introductory form of embroidery taught to children in the 1800s and the 1900s. It was also a way for a woman with skills in pattern stamping or embroidery to generate their own source of income from the home. This redwork quilt has blocks with USA government buildings and politicians on them, as well as many other designs. This quilt was made with pre-stamped pattern blocks. It was likely made in the States and brought to Whitby when the family moved up here. Here is another horseshoe done in redwork. It was made sometime after 1933, when Roosevelt was elected for the first time. Baskets were a common theme, done in embroidery and piecing. The lovely embroidery on this quilt is done in outline stitch, blanket stitch, and French knots. The sashing, done in stripes, includes cornerstones of 9 patches in the pink and white. The one square we have here is a pieced basket. Though the basket itself was done in one color, the contents were scrappy. This fan pattern is another scrappy quilt. It was probably made after 1856 because the use of commercial dyes in the fabrics. The seams of this pattern are decorated with a herringbone embroidery stitch. We can see the fine hand stitching in the quilting here. The stitches are close together and even. It takes much practice to achieve a good quilting stitch. Applique is done by stitching cloth shapes onto a background fabric. This type of applique is called needle turn applique. The shapes to be applied are cut slightly larger than the final shape needed. Then the edges are turned under and the piece of fabric is carefully stitched down with an invisibly placed stitch. This quilt has lovely flowers and stems stitched onto a white background. Signature quilts were usually made as a presentation quilt or to celebrate a special event. The quilt makers would embroider the names on fabric squares and put the squares together to make a quilt top. This signature quilt was made by a Whitby church ladies group as a fundraiser. You paid to have your name added to the quilt. Each wheel design on the quilt holds about 18 signatures. There are 30 wheels, so we have 540 signatures of people in Whitby. The strips of light purple cloth between the squares that hold the signature wheels are called sashing. Our most famous quilt is a VDJC club quilt. It is a Redwork signature quilt made in 1897 by a group of Whitby women to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. It features a crokinole board in the center. We are not sure if the C in VDJC is for celebration or crokinole. The blocks in the quilt were each designed, signed, and stitched in Redwork by a member of the club. The narrow frills that edged the quilt were common in the quilts of the later Victorian age. One of the signatures on the quilt is that of Florence Helen McGilvray. Florence McGilvray was also known as F.H. McGilvray. She was a famous Canadian landscape painter known for her post-impressionist style. Her home was in Whitby, Ontario. The Station Gallery in Whitby has one of her paintings in its permanent collection. Many of the signatures on the VDJC quilt were from the Dow family. You can see here pictures of the different ladies who helped make the quilt. The young woman is Isabella Dow, daughter of William Gerard Dow and Annie McAllen. William G. Dow and family moved to Manitoba in 1890. Isabella returned to visit her grandmother in 1897. Probably the quilt was made for her to take back out west. It was returned to Whitby by Isabella Dow's descendants. Whatever the pattern used or the material, these quilts represent the industry and creativity of the women who made them. They are truly works of art. There are many more quilts at the Lynde House Museum. If you would like a guided tour and see them for yourself, go to the website lindhousemuseum.com and make an appointment.